Hello, I'm John Greiner with Basin Safety Consulting and Training. It's good to see all you lovely people out there in cyberspace. This month we're going to be covering two topics. We're going to be covering accident reporting as well as heat illness prevention. Moving into June here, it's a good thing to kind of start talking about what can go wrong while out there in the field regarding heat. So a good blend of topics. So the first thing I want to talk about is accident reporting requirements. Now, each company is going to have a specific set of guidelines, requirements, contact lists, timing requirements, as well as reporting to their customers and what their customers expect. And there's some guidelines by OSHA as well. So in addition to the specifics for each company, you're going to have action items. What goes first, what happens second, third, fourth, and for the most part, these are going to be pretty standard across most companies, as well as situations. However, every once in a while, the people in the field are going to have to make split-second decisions to determine what the best course of action is. So this is really a guideline, and as we'll talk about a few different items and areas where specific or custom decisions are going to have to be made. So as well as comprehensive requirements along the other list of things that I mentioned is understanding what is expected of you if you're involved in an accident, if you witness an accident, and then the investigation procedure afterwards. So OSHA does have a couple of requirements. The first one is if a hospitalization occurs, then they want to know about it within 24 hours. If a fatality occurs, they want to know about it within 8 hours. The reason for that is typically they know that a lot of contacts are going to have to be made prior to their knowledge, and they're not going to be able to do anything involved in the actual incident or accident response. They just need to know about it, categorize it. And the goal of all of this, as you probably all know, is to avoid it happening again. So if I walk outside in the winter and slip on a sheet of ice, if I don't tell anyone about it, maybe I only bruise my my hindquarters a little bit, or maybe even tweak my wrist. That may not be that serious. But if I don't report it, then the next person that walks across that same sheet of ice, they may break a hip. In fact, the OSHA fatality log this year actually has one person falling on the ice on the flat ground and actually dying from it. The specifics of which you can read on the OSHA fatality log. If you're like me, a safety guy, you look at that pretty often. If you're not, it's a little bit morbid if you did, but it is out there for all you guys to learn and understand from. So the best practices are also out there for accident reporting, when to report and what to report when you report it. A lot of times when I get an accident call, it's a little bit of a frenzied call. This is what happened. We're not sure what's going on. So when you make those calls, some best practices are understand what, who, when, where, and why. And sometimes even a how thrown in there with the why, which sometimes will not be available right after an accident. If it's something small like slipping on the ice or rolling your ankle on a piece of scoria, the answer may be relatively basic. Stepped out of the truck, large piece of scoria, didn't pay attention to it, rolled my ankle. Sometimes if it's dropped equipment or equipment failure, etc., it may take a little bit more investigation before you get to the final reason as of why, or what we call in the safety world the root cause for the accident. So step one in any accident reporting or any accident program, incident program, is prevention. What you can do to prevent an accident from happening in the first place. And a big part of this is doing a hazard assessment, understanding what can fail, either both from a safety perspective or an efficiency perspective, because typically they go right hand in hand. So what can fail? First of all, you're going to look at your workplace layout. Is it set up correctly? Is equipment staged in the right place? Is everything at the right height, setting? Do you have the right tools with you? Also, the path that you're going to be working that day. So not just right around the area where you're having your JSA meeting or your toolbox meeting, but the entire area. Do a nice scan, whether it's a walk-through, a drive around, to make sure everything's where it's supposed to be and there's nothing that's going to prevent you from doing the work effectively. Also, overhead hazards, anything above you that could cause problems. Power lines, cranes, are we working around heavy equipment? Also vehicles, are there any vehicles in the way, or does the vehicle positioning affect the job at all? Is it backed in? Should it be backed in? And 9 times out of 10 you want your vehicles backed in. Also mechanical equipment, can it fail? Is it guarded properly? Is it in their correct position, the right setting, etc.? Pressurized equipment such as flow lines, pipelines, etc., even tanks or treaters could be considered pressurized equipment. Are there hazards associated with that equipment that's going to affect you being able to do the job correctly? And lastly, energized equipment, electrical, powered, etc. And a big part of that hazard assessment is obviously planning the work with your team. Typically, work's going to be planned prior to even leaving for the site. There's going to be a meeting with the supervisor or the customer saying, this is what we need done, this is how long we want you to be able to do it in, and this is what we want our price to be. So with all of those, really includes an initial assessment of the job, a plan of the job, and then once you get there, a hazard assessment. And the way I want you to look at hazard assessments isn't just, let me identify every possible hazard, although that's a big piece of it, but also look at it from the perspective of what can fail, both from safety, as I mentioned, and efficiency. What can go wrong? Well, if we don't have the right tools, then the job's going to be extended, or we're going to have to makeshift tools, which obviously is not typically a good idea, because then you get into having the wrong tool for the job. And in previous trainings, we talked about not having the right tool for the job and potential issues with that. So you have the mobilization piece, what can fail, preparing for the work, loading up the trucks, make sure you don't leave anything, having some sort of checklist, as well as pre-trips for the vehicles and trailers. Prior to work, when you get to the site, what can go wrong? Do you have enough people? Are they trained properly, etc.? While preparing for work, so when you're getting ready for work, everything that goes into it, do you have the right equipment, tools, people, etc.? During the work, while doing the job, what could go wrong? Do you have enough spacing? Do you have enough pipe? Do you have enough, once again, people to do the work, the right tools to do the work? Finalizing the work, when you're finally finishing up, do you have the right bolt-up equipment? Do you have the right saws, blades, etc.? And lastly, clean up and demob. Do you have the right cleanup material? Do you have a dumpster? Do you have a trash trailer? It's whatever you need to do the job. You want to think the whole process through from both the safety and the efficiency standpoint to understand what can go wrong, to make sure that you avoid that on the front end rather than running into a hang-up and extending the job or potentially putting someone at risk. So if during the course of a job something happens, unintended, that causes an accident, you want to first assess the severity of the situation. If it's a rolled ankle, maybe not that serious. If it's a fire, maybe very serious. If it's a serious injury, how bad of a situation are we in? And we're going to go through kind of the terminology for how to express the severity of an accident, and what we at Basin Safety feel is a good way to clarify that. So taking appropriate action after assessment is a big thing. The first part of that is preventing someone else from being affected, or preventing something else from being affected. We've all seen the videos online of blizzards and ice storms where there's a small accident between two vehicles, but then there's other vehicles coming down the road. And one accident can have a chain reaction effect of multiple accidents afterwards. If a fire happens, especially if it's involving natural gas or oil, have we isolated that fire so it doesn't continue to spread? If there's a grass fire, a tree fire, have we cut down the trees? Have we bladed behind the grass so it doesn't extend past a certain point, for example? And then secondly, performing medical care if it's minor, or contacting appropriate personnel if it's serious prior to performing medical care, depending on how many people are on site. Can you delegate someone to call 911 or your medical response group? Who do you have out there available? So those two are, as I mentioned earlier, kind of a situational requirement depending on who you have, who's available, and what the actual scenario is. So first we're going to talk about assessing severity from a property damage perspective. And these words are all going to kind of, between property damage and injuries are going to kind of follow the same suit. So first of all, you have a minor property damage, major, serious, or catastrophic. So in a minor, typically you're going to have minimal impact to equipment or the job. For example, a fender bender doesn't impact your ability to do the job. Dropping a tool and breaking it may or may not, minor. Like something happened, we want to talk about it, report it so everybody's kind of aware of what's going on, but probably doesn't affect the ability to do the work. That's a minor property damage incident. A major one is failure to, for examples, failure of equipment, work has stopped, the project has been postponed or delayed, and there was a potential for a minor injury, or there was a minor injury. Sometimes these two can overlap. So in that instance, you're looking at, hey, man, this almost dropped on that guy over there, and it could have been really bad. Or this almost swung into a guy, it could have been really bad. Billy almost got, hit by that loader. He was, bending over while it was backing up on the other side of the site, whatever. Those we're going to consider major property damage incidents. And obviously, something was damaged. Serious. Fire we have explosions, potential for serious injuries are out there. So, something really bad happened. There's a significant cost, obviously, additionally to project delay, the work having to stop, be postponed, etc. And lastly, we have catastrophic. And there's different ways that people define this. I define it as anything over $500,000. Some people define it as $1 million, because at that point we're hitting insurance premium limits, et cetera, or insurance payout limits. But I consider anything over $500,000, as well as loss of well control, loss of control of equipment, and potentially, obviously, an injury that occurred. So with injuries, we have a few different levels as well. We have first aid. Basically, a first aid is somebody does not need to go to the hospital. In your first aid kit that you should have in your pickup or available on the job site, you have the equipment and the supplies necessary to mitigate that. Maybe it's a little bit of a strain, a Band-Aid, something small, maybe even a strain. Then a minor, non-recordable. This is typically where it's like, hey, this person needs medical attention, but maybe they don't need to take prescriptions or be sent home or not be able to continue to work. So in that instance, and I really recommend this, especially for anything that could be, and bruising would be in both of these categories as well, but sometimes internal bleeding can be serious and not visible from the surface, so that's something else to keep in mind too. And pain levels are not a great indicator of the severity of an incident, and the reason I say that is everybody has a different tolerance to pain, and the way the body processes pain isn't, there's no function like pain level 4 equals X. It doesn't work like that. So there may be a multiple reasons somebody doesn't feel pain at the beginning. And some of us have experienced this where we, at the end of the day, we'll look down and be like, oh man, I cut myself, I didn't even notice. Whereas in a certain, depending on what's going on, you may have noticed at home or if you weren't as involved in the work. So pain level isn't always a good indicator. In fact, it's a terrible indicator of the severity of an injury. Then we have serious, which is potentially recordable. It may or may not be, depending on, there's a lot of gray area in 1903 when it comes to what's recordable, what's not recordable. But even things like stitches, a broken tooth, a broken bone, and then once again, work restrictions, meaning that person can't go back to work the next day doing the same job. They may be able to go back and just be a driver, a parts runner, file paperwork, administrative duties. Then we're getting into the serious level of injury. And then lastly, major. And this is where a hospitalization occurs, definitely a recordable injury, work restrictions, et cetera. They're laid up, they can't go to work, they can't do their job normally. And then lastly, catastrophic, which is obviously fatality. So in that instance, there would be a loss of life. So after you've assessed severity, you understand kind of how serious the issue is, what the appropriate steps are. Does he need to go to the hospital right now? Can we wait for transport? Can we transport him? All those different scenarios need to be understood and discussed, or decisions to be made. Then you're going to contact appropriate personnel. So based in safety, we make these and we have them for ourselves. We kind of have a small little pocket card that discusses emergency response steps, as well as everyone who to call when something happens and their phone numbers. So occupational or medical emergency people, there are phone numbers. There's two companies out here that come to mind. One is Extreme MD, the other is Axiom. And typically most of our operators have some link to these outfits, and what they provide is essentially a 1-800 number, 24/7 support with a medical professional. You explain to them what happened, what the symptoms are, and they can walk you through the proper steps. He needs to go to the hospital. He may not need to go to the hospital. He needs to go now. You can wait to the end of the shift, whatever it is. They're going to give you a little bit of direction, because personally, I am trained in first aid CPR, but I'm not a medical professional. That's not my line of work. I'm not an EMT. So I can't assess that and give proper medical advice, and most of us in the field are in the same boat. So secondly, obviously 911 is available to everybody. Then the supervisor, and then potentially the police if necessary. So I really recommend having one point of contact within your company that you call if there's an emergency. That way you're not wondering who to call. Oh, if it's this kind of emergency, I call this guy. If it's this kind of emergency, I call this person. Just making it very clear, clean cut. This is the person I call. Now I put media and phones in here. Taking video and pictures right away, and it's obviously good for reporting and kind of confirming what happened, but sharing that with anybody outside of your organization can be cause for dismissal. So just be prepared for that. You don't want your stuff being on Bach and Fail of the Day. You wouldn't want someone taking a picture of you or your accident and that ending up on Bach and Fail of the Day. Don't get me wrong. I laugh when I see a lot of that stuff. However, with you and myself and our customer base and your company, we don't want our stuff on Bach and Fail of the Day. So reporting time is another consideration here. When should you report? The answer is always immediately. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mentioned internal bleeding earlier being one of them, and we're going to get into some of the medical concerns, but also just from the perspective of preventing it from happening to somebody else, as well as transparency. If you, for example, roll your ankle, hurt your wrist, a finger, whatever, even if it's a small thing that doesn't really have a lot of impact to the ability to do the job, but go home that night, it swells up to twice its size. And you don't go in the next morning, you call, before you go to work, hey, I can't go in today, I've got to go see our occupational doctor, get checked out, because this happened yesterday. Well, now your company that you work for is in a little bit of a pickle because they didn't know about it, so obviously they have to change the work scope for that day. But then secondly, the customers that they work for require immediate reporting of any incident that happens right away, regardless of severity. And if they didn't do that, then there's always going to be a question of, can we trust this company? Because we've set up a requirement and it hasn't been met. So even if it doesn't seem serious, you could be viewed as somebody who's not being transparent. The company could be viewed as a company that's not being transparent, and that can create reputation issues that essentially affect your ability to work for the operators out there in the field. So make sure, even if it's at the shop though, even if it's not out on location, even if it's the shop, even if it's going to work or going home from work, immediately report that stuff. Don't wait to say something until it gets serious, because at that point there's a whole other myriad of things that can go wrong. So typically within the existing working shift, you want to make that call, send the email, send the text, hey, this is what happened, this is how serious it is, I think I can keep working. It's just a basic first aid. I cut my finger on a pipe wrench, whatever. You want to communicate that right away. If medical attention is necessary, obviously you want to report that, but that should be completed that day. You don't want medical attention to wait until the following day before you go to work. And then regardless of type of injury, an incident must essentially, as I mentioned, customers want to know this stuff right away. So final report of these is also typically due within 24 hours of the incident occurring. So it happens 2 p.m. on a Monday. By 2 p.m. on Wednesday, on Tuesday, customers are going to want to have some information about it. A little bit of investigation. It may not be thorough at this point, but just a basic understanding of what happened. So you want to make sure to get this out there right away. So the purpose and importance of this, I already kind of talked about it from a reputation standpoint, but even in an emergency situation, timing is everything, and people need to be essentially prepared to act right away, especially if it's serious or we don't know how serious it is. With 15 milliliters of blood loss, 30 minutes until somebody loses their life. That's 15 milliliters per minute. After the heart stops, you have 60 minutes until expiration without CPR. So, 6, not 60. That'd be actually pretty impressive. Hemorrhaging or internal bleeding can be fatal if not caught within 6 hours. So, serious bruise, especially near the organs, the abdomen, the neck, the head, they may not seem serious. The person may not even be in a lot of pain, but internally there can be things going on that we don't see. So that's another reason we want to get people to a medical doctor right away, even if it's a minor incident, anything beyond first aid. And then lastly, I already mentioned it. Reputation can be a big issue, and then not assessing injuries right away can cause another issue. All right, so for serious incidents, really, and I'm going to go ahead and go to the whiteboard here. There's a process you want to go through, and as I mentioned, not every situation is perfectly laid out in this process, but this is kind of a good rule of thumb. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the whiteboard here and give us a little bit of a picture of what we need to be doing. So first off, if an incident occurs, the first thing we want to do is get everyone to the muster point. So let's say you're on a location. Give ourselves a little location here, or work site. And it really doesn't matter if it's a well site, it's a midstream facility, it's a truck yard. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's serious now, once again, you cut your finger, you don't need to evacuate the well site to the muster point. But let's say this is our muster point. We got our windsock up here. We're upwind. we're crosswind, everybody's safe, okay? Maybe it's off location. In this case, it's on location. So that's the first thing you want to do. Then you want to go ahead and take down the names of everybody that you know to be on that location. Make sure that everybody's there and that nobody else is in the issue. So let's say we have our wellhead here, we have our treater over here, here's our tank farm, and here's the entrance, or this may be the entrance. You may have two entrances. You want to get everyone to that muster point and take the head count, the first thing you want to do. Then you want to make sure that everyone has been contacted. So you're going to take out your emergency contact list. We've contacted the supervisor. We've contacted 911 if necessary, or the medical people if necessary. We've contacted, the customer representation, and that may be you may want to leave that to the supervisor. Check with your company. They may want you to make all the calls. They may just want you to direct it to the supervisor and then have them make the calls. Each one of your companies is going to be a little bit different. Then also arranging transport. So if somebody does get hurt, you want to make sure that, hey, this is the guy that got hurt. Who's going to drive him to the hospital? Who's responsible for that? And it's a great idea, in my opinion, to do this as a part of the JSA, to assign somebody as kind of the designated driver, so that if someone does need to get out of there quickly, you're not waiting. Even minutes, even seconds in an emergency situation can have an impact to how serious that injury becomes. So having that kind of lined out beforehand, arranging transport and getting him to where he needs to go, whether it's the hospital or not. And then lastly, we want to, excuse me one second here, we want to, obviously, depending on the situation, perform medical rescue. So if someone's down over here, we all get to the muster point. If you're trained to do so, you want to perform rescue, CPR, first aid, etc. Now, if you're not, then you need to wait for, obviously, the 911 guys, the EMTs, and rescue personnel to get there. The challenge, as we know, is most of our locations from an aggregate perspective are far away from medical facilities. So getting someone there, or even fire stations, getting someone there and if you're not trained to rescue them, can take quite some time, which can obviously increase the severity of that accident, whether or not that person's rescued in time. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and move off the whiteboard here, back to the chair. All right, so scene preservation. This is just kind of a side piece here. Obviously, you want to leave everything alone after an accident happens. So if we have an incident that occurs, we don't want to be moving things around, moving pipe around. We don't want to make the location look good for when the muckety-mucks come. We want to make sure that we are leaving everything alone so that when the investigation happens, we can recreate the situation as realistically as possible. Secondly, you want to take photos if necessary. If you do have to move things around for safety reasons, or there's an accident, you need to move it off the road, take photos prior to moving things so that we, once again, can recreate that incident. Cordon off any areas where you don't want people to enter. That could be through basic means, cones, safety tape, etc. Sometimes more permanent type cordoning off, depending on what it is. Then obviously assess personnel. If you're going to be taking witness statements, which we'll talk about in a little bit, if somebody's in shock or seriously kind of blown away about what happened, you don't want to be, hey, give me your statement right now when they're, out of sorts. That's not a great thing. You want to make sure everyone's okay. Outside of medical care for the physical body, obviously psychological issues do crop up, so you want to make sure that you're assessing people for really where they're at. And then a lot of times after an incident occurs, it's a waiting game. Customers may want you to wait there. Keeping everyone together, as long as they're capable of giving a statement, to get those statements then, rather than a day later or 2 days later or a week later, is important to actually get an honest assessment of what happened. And all this, and I'll mention this later again, but it's not about assigning blame, like, oh, we got to figure out which one of these guys is responsible for this situation. That may end up coming out that, hey, this person or that person was directly responsible, but that's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to say, hey, where did we break down? Was it training? Was it procedures? Did a storm crop up? Was there some equipment that failed? Really understanding to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So a few things about witness statements here. We want to make sure we get one from everyone, even if they weren't involved in the accident, even if they didn't witness it. If it was over here by the wellhead and you have a guy working at the flare, didn't see a dang thing, that you still want him, I heard rustling, people yelling, shouting, get to the muster point, that statement, it's good to understand where people were at and what happened. So getting witness statements from everybody. If you're asked to fill out a witness statement, even if you weren't involved, fill it out. Even if it's minimal, it's good to have more data than less data. And then, once again, at this point, you as the person filling it out or requesting the information, you want to get some basics. Who, what, where, when, why. Once again, if why is known. And then provide clear data without speculation. I think that this happened, or, after we talked about it, none of that matters. It's data, specific facts from your perspective. I heard this, I saw that at this time. This was who was over there. Specific information following the kind of the 5 W's. So as I mentioned before, when we do an investigation to understand what occurred, we're going to be looking at 4 basic things: procedures, training, environment, and equipment. On the procedure side, we want to know, was there a procedure for doing this task appropriately? Let's say they were changing out a belt in a pumping unit, right? The big belt that kind of drives that. They're changing it out, they didn't use the proper man lift, or they didn't crane it properly, and it broke and it fell. Well, was there a procedure for it? Did we say step 1, step 2, step 3? Remove the bolts, make sure that there's a proper eyelet. If not, that you're using the proper rigging techniques, etc. If that didn't exist, or it was just kind of talked about, floating out there in the universe, that's not a good procedure. Procedures should be written down, they should be clear, they should be simple. Most procedures you should be able to write with a supervisor or a manager and the field techs within a short period of time. If you need any help with that, Basin Safety writes a lot of these every year. We have really qualified people that can help kind of get that discussion going. Secondly, training. Even if there was a procedure, procedures are great. They're sitting on the shelf not doing anything, not doing a lot of good. So have we trained the personnel to the proper procedure? Is it written down? Is it clear? Do we have verification that the guys working out there know what the procedure is? Then lastly, environment. As I mentioned, weather, workplace layout, once again, ruts, gravel, scoria, ice, blizzard, rainstorm, lightning, whatever the issues are, what was the environmental impact? We want to know that. Wind speed, etc. And then equipment. Was the equipment properly inspected? Was it maintained properly? Was it rated for the type of work that it was doing, etc.? And then lastly, historical precedents. And as I mentioned earlier with the OSHA 300, the OSHA fatality report, which pulls from the 300 logs, does this happen a lot? And if you read through that web page, you just Google that, OSHA fatality report, it's very interesting to kind of read through, even just this year, that I think there's 50 or 60 fatalities in the United States this year alone. And a lot of them are the same issues recurring over and over again in different places. A lot of people being struck by trucks, heavy equipment, falling off of things, falling off of ladders, trees falling down on top of people. And if I'm a worker in a specific field, I open up that website and say, hey, loading dock worker crushed by truck backing up. I'm thinking, hey, dang, I work around trucks that back up all the time. How do I prevent myself from becoming on this list? Being knowledgeable yourself. I know we're out of school now, but kind of knowing, what the hazards are in your industry can be figured out by historical precedents, or even Googling the type of work that you do and putting in accidents to know what you can do to prevent that. And a lot of us safety guys, our big value is knowing what's happened in the past to ensure that we can prevent it in the future. And fortunately, in my case, or unfortunately, there's been a lot of instances that I've been through and experienced, so now I know, hey, this happened even if it was 12 years ago on a site over here in Montana or over there in North Dakota, to be able to assess and give people information. So on the reporting side, and then we're going to be wrapping this up pretty soon, after accident investigation statements, now we have the report. Reports, just to give you guys a picture, here's an example of one of our electronic ones that we fill out. They should be concise, thorough, clarify the 5 W's, sign corrective actions, and avoid, once again, assigning blame. The point of this isn't to say Billy messed up. The point is that he followed his training, not he made a dumb move. That's not very effective. So then we can assess retraining, for example, or Billy didn't have a procedure to follow. Okay, now we have to create a procedure to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And then typically a lot of times at that point we'll make a safety alert, alerting everyone in the company what happened to make sure it doesn't happen again. Well, that concludes our accident reporting and investigation topic. Now we're going to move into heat illness prevention. We're going to move through this relatively quickly. A lot of this is pretty straightforward, things that you already know. Here I have a heat stroke image, and there's heat stress, heat stroke, heat illness, heat sickness. There's a lot of different heat things, but essentially what happens to our body is we get to a point where it heats to a certain temperature where it cannot cool itself down, regardless of how much water you drink. So the goal is obviously to keep our body consistently under that temperature. And it can typically happen over 85 degrees because it can be kind of a multiplying effect. So here's a few different things that you're going to experience, first of all, if you are experiencing heat stroke. The first thing you're going to experience is a little bit of nausea, potentially, a little bit of lightheadedness. You're not going to have a lot of, I'm going to move closer here a little bit to see the smallness. You're going to have, you're going to stop sweating, which is another issue that we experience, is you stop sweating. And why would that be? Well, your body's out of fluid to get rid of it. And obviously sweating is the way that your body cools itself down. Then potentially there may be some vomiting involved, etc. And so making sure that you have enough fluid in the first place. And there is a point where no matter how much fluid you drink, your body cannot cool itself down. And once again, that's going to lead to a heat stroke potentially. So alcohol is not your friend because it dehydrates you. Coffee, the same thing, is not your friend. Energy drinks are not your friend. Anything with sugar is not your friend because your body takes water to process that. So you essentially want to use, if you can, eat foods that have a lot of water naturally, such as vegetables, fruits, etc., to provide that hydration. Gatorade's obviously really good for you, even though it has a little bit of sugar. There are sugar-free options, but you want to have fluids that replenish your body's electrolytes as well as the water, salt, etc., that your body needs to cool itself. So shade is another big deal. You can take a shower, staying out of the sun, wearing the right kind of clothing. Now in Texas, this is a big issue. It's 85 degrees or higher pretty much for 4 months straight, even at nighttime. So in that instance, when we're wearing FR clothing, you're going to run into the problem of wearing clothing that heats you up because it's made of canvas typically. And so there is summer style FR. Typically it's an FR1, which FR has ratings from 1 to 4, even 5 I think sometimes when you get into different materials. But that's kind of the protective layer level, but it's also typically related to thickness. So there is FR clothing that you can actually see through, when you hold it up to light, typically in the FR1 category. Get as light of FR clothing, if you have to wear FR clothing, as possible. So you're not incentivized to roll the sleeves up, etc. And there are cooling layers that you can get as well. In fact, we sell here at Basin Safety a brand of FR that you can insert an ice pack into the back. You just freeze it overnight, and it typically lasts for about 12 hours, and that can help keep you cool. So there's additional, and it's just regular FR jumpsuit. Also has elbow pads and knee pads that you can put in there. It's pretty cool. Basically what I'm saying is there's lots of different tools out there to help yourself keep cool so that you don't experience heat stress or other heat-related illnesses. So how to prevent, we're going to talk about now how to prevent heat stress, some emergency response requirements, as well as some processes. So OSHA does have a standard specifically for heat illness prevention. It's a 1910. It applies to outdoor places of employment with a heat illness potential, which is really anywhere over 85 degrees. So heat illness prevention, we want to first of all train the supervisors, employees, which we're doing here today. Obviously making sure water's available, and then local procedures for heat illness prevention. Here, not as serious, much shorter time span where we have higher temperatures, but it's still a major issue, especially because we are not typically used to having those temperatures year-round. So we may not have the strategies or the physical capabilities of cooling ourselves down as easily. So prior to work in warm weather, we want to have a few different things covered. So we want to make sure that your department or your company's heat illness prevention document is created, and people understand, hey, if it's 90 degrees plus today, we need to make sure we take at least 25-minute breaks in the shade or in the AC, et cetera. Environmental potential risk impacts. Some things include even like, hey, it's dry, it's really hot outside, we're welding, there's grass. Like, what are the potential impacts of the heat that we're going to experience? Also, the importance of consistently consuming water and other hydrating fluids, importance of acclimatization. As I said, us North Dakotans and northern people, we're not used to it, so it's going to have a different impact on us than people from the south. What the signs are of heat illness or heat stress, the importance of reporting them immediately, and then also emergency response procedures after something happens. So getting into heat illness directly. What are the risk factors? We've already talked about a few of them. Humidity is another one, not just temperature, how humid it is. Obviously, the higher the humidity, the higher likelihood of experiencing some sort of heat stress because your body can't cool itself down. And especially in Texas and New Mexico, Oklahoma, you're outside. You have to take a shower as soon as you step outside because you're instantly doused in sweat. That's removing salt and water from your body that you need to stay cool. Obviously, radiant heat, conductive heat. So if you're working outside and then using a heat element or working around something that's hot, such as a treater or fluids that give off their own heat, metal that gives off its own heat, cement, concrete, asphalt that gives off its own heat, that's just going to multiply the effect. Even the color of the equipment and material that you're working around, if you're working around something like a black surface or around a black truck, if you guys probably experience this, it can give off its own heat source, which once again adds to the temperature, which makes it harder for you to cool down. So we talked a little about PPE, and we'll get into that more in a bit. So obviously, personal risk factors occur. How old are you? How used are you to heat like that? Are you in great physical shape or not? How much water have you been drinking? Alcohol, drugs? How much? What medications are you taking? Some medications actually affect your ability to retain water. So, how it handles heat, as we mentioned, it's always trying to keep its internal temperature essentially between 97 and 99 degrees, respectively. That's where we want to be. And certain illnesses can obviously increase that or decrease it. So what happens, the body starts sending more blood to the skin, which is kind of an insulator or a cooler. So as it happens, water pushes out, and now you have a lot of blood in your skin. Well, that can cause additional issues. You're not getting enough blood to the heart, enough blood to the head. That's where your dizziness, your lightheadedness, your nausea comes from. So as the water and salt leaves your body, that's also going to cause additional issues. And the signs and symptoms of that are things I mentioned earlier: headache, dizziness, vomiting, muscle cramps because there's not enough water in your muscles to be working effectively. So add to the fact that you're outside, now you're using your muscles a lot, which obviously require water and blood as well to work effectively, and your body's using all that to keep you cool. And then one of the first signs, though, a lot of people don't talk about is irritability and confusion. If you're outside, you've been working for a couple hours, and everything's ticking you off, making you mad, you're just frustrated, don't just call it a case of the Mondays. Recognize, hey, typically this kind of stuff doesn't bother me. Why am I so irritable? Heat illness, that's the first thing that you're going to notice is that irritability and the stress. And then obviously upset stomach. If you've eaten normal, nothing weird, and your stomach just starts to hurt or feel weird or gurgly, that's your body telling you something's wrong. You don't have enough water, et cetera. It's giving you that message. So heat stroke, getting into that, as I mentioned, it's a complete breakdown of the cooling system. Your body cannot cool itself no matter what you do to it. That requires medical attention immediately. So sweating stops, skin is hot, skin can be red, dry, start to crack a little bit. Once again, fainting, seizures or convulsions can also accompany heat stroke. 911 is necessary immediately. There's nothing you can do for that guy in the field that's going to cool him down. Obviously still giving him fluids, cooling him down. If you can put him in a cool truck, that can help, but the body, even though it's cool outside, the system's broken. It's not cooling itself down. There's no thermometer that you can turn it down now. It's past that point. So that's why you need to get them to a doctor as soon as possible. You can also loosen or remove clothing, which helps. Fan and then mist the person with water helps. Applying a water-soaked towel or ice pack wrapped around the towel to the head and ice or pack into the armpits. So basically where your body generates the most heat, which is your head, your armpits, even your hands, that's where you want to apply the cooler material to get them cooled off. So how do we prevent that from happening? Obviously, access to water, as I mentioned, is a big deal. Shade is another big deal. Making sure you're out of the sun and you have enough fluids in your body. And 4 cups per hour for the entire ship. Basically, the rule of thumb here is for every hour you're on the job, you want to have at least 1, maybe 2 bottles of water. So by the end of the day, you may be pumping 16 bottles of water in you, but that's how you keep that cooling system activated. You're going to be using the bathroom a lot. It's going to slow down the job a little bit. You're going to have to take more breaks, but at the end of the day, we're going to prevent somebody from passing out from heat exhaustion. This happens all the time. They have fatalities in Texas every single year from this very problem. And it's like, hey, there's enough bottled water out here. Obviously, a couple months ago, it was rough to find, but now it's kind of replenished. There's enough bottled, and it's cheap enough. You can get a 24-pack of water from Walmart for $2. So maybe you have to spend less than $2 a day to keep yourself from passing out, I'd say that's a wise investment. And the companies typically are going to help with this as well. They may not buy you the Evian or the Fiji waters that you are accustomed to out here in the oil field. So you got all that money floating around, but still, water is water. As shaded rest areas can be provided, you want to have it right there next to them, if available, inside of a truck, etc. So lastly, we're going to conclude with some supervisory guidance. If you're a supervisor, what is expected of you in this world, because there is some OSHA guidance required. So obviously planning the work, hey, we're going to be 12 hours away, or we're going to be out for 12 hours, 2 hours away from our job, from our office. There's not going to be a lot of commuting back and forth. What can we do to prevent this person from being impacted by the sun? How many hours are we expecting them to work? And if you expect them to get 12 hours of work done, but they need to take a break every 30 minutes or every 40 minutes to cool down, you need to temper your expectations and really understand the true capability of the guys without putting them in harm's way. So obviously weather is something we deal with every day, but on warmer periods, especially days over 85, supervisors, that's really where you want to start thinking about this is, hey, what's the temperature forecast today? 85 plus. All right, we got to make some contingencies. In this instance, make sure we have enough water. And once again, how much water? No one's probably going to drink 16 bottles of water a day, but that's a good inventory level to keep in mind. Hey, maybe my guys are getting really hydrated. I want to make sure they have plenty of water with them. Climatization, also knowing the guys that are working for you. If you got a bunch of guys from Texas, they may be able to handle a little bit better up here in the heat. But if they're from Wilson, North Dakota, or Canada, or Montana, they're probably not going to be able to work as long in the heat just because they're not acclimatized to it. So obviously, you want to make sure the shade is present. What that looks like is going to be different, or they can get inside of a truck, which typically in our world, you have a pickup truck or an office shack nearby to get into to cool off. Staff are reminded throughout the day to drink plenty of water, and you are going to have to remind them about every hour. I recommend, hey guys, make sure you're drinking water, and don't just let them do this. Yeah, we're drinking water, boss. Be like, no, I want to watch you guys drink that bottle of water. Maybe you could have a chugging contest. I don't know if that's a great idea, but something to incentivize people drinking their water. Regular monitoring them, make sure that everybody's feeling good, okay, no nausea, no irritability, etc. And then also close supervision of new employees, people who haven't worked at all or haven't done your type of work in the field as well, knowing who they are and definitely paying extra close attention to them in the field. So written procedures can be basic. I've seen companies have just a one sheet. It's got a little chart on there of the heat index. Hey, this is what it looks like. And then if you're dehydrated, they'll have a urine chart on there, what color your urine is, and that's a really good indicator of not being hydrated enough. Some people I know, they don't like drinking water, period. They're just not water drinkers. They drink coffee, they drink, lemonade, they drink whatever, beer. They do not drink water. That's just not their style. In this instance, it's not about preference. If you're out there working, you need to be drinking things that are going to give your body fluids. Monster Energy will keep you hydrated for about 10 minutes, and then it's going to start depleting as it's processing the chemicals that are in through your liver. So you want to make sure you have water and plenty of it. So that the process and the procedure can be a one-sheet document. It doesn't need to be a 50-page document on how to keep people cool, but you need to have something written down that people can understand what the expectation is, because if it's not written down, it's a little bit of a gray area what's actually expected of them. So write it down, make it clear to them, make sure they've read through it, signed it, or at least got a copy of what your materials are. So kind of wrapping this up, keeping track of your guys, making sure they have the proper inventory of water before the day, developing, training them on any heat illness prevention strategies you have, whether it's how many bottles of water to drink, how many breaks to take during the day, how many trucks you need to have out there, where the shade is, whatever your company is experiencing, make sure they have that available to them. And then assessing the work and what can feasibly be done in higher temperatures. And it's just like cold. We don't expect guys to get twice as much work done when it's negative 40. You anticipate it's going to be a less effective day, a less efficient day. And also putting that into your guys' heads that you understand that, because as I mentioned earlier, what we value is efficiency, being able to do things quickly, being able to do them faster than we did before. And that's what makes us feel good at the end of the day, that we are effective at our jobs and can do our job quickly and safely. So knowing that and knowing what motivates your people and letting them know, hey, you need to dial down that expectation a couple notches, because we're going to have to take more breaks. enjoy it. Get your little umbrella, maybe put that in your ice water glass, just pretend you're on the beach sipping a pina colada, which maybe we can do in like 2025 now with everything going on. Do whatever you can to kind of minimize that expectation. And on accident and incident reporting, kind of summarizing that as well, very important, report immediately. Don't wait. Don't hope it's going to get better. If it's anything above something minor, even a first aid, you want to report that first aid. Anything above a paper cut is what a lot of people say. You want to let someone know. And supervisors, if you get that information, document it. Send an email to your supervisor and say, hey, nothing serious, but guy, cut his finger on whatever, just let you know. Or twisted his ankle out here, just let you know. Last thing I want to leave you with is pre-existing injuries and workman's comp. How do those two things work? So I'm going to make this very basic for you. If you have a pre-existing injury and doing something basic, even sometimes it can be sneezing or coughing or bending over, and it happens at work, that may or may not be covered by workman's comp, just to let you know. Because essentially what workman's comp does is it pays you out money for not being able to work because of an injury that happened due to your work. And if it's something that you've already had now insurance will still cover it, unemployment insurance, all that's going to be in place. But as far as workman's comp, its design is to be an insurance policy for unsafe work. And so what you have to ask yourself is, was this unsafe work or was it a pre-existing condition? And that's why when you go to the doctor of any sort, even if it's an occupational doctor, you fill out that first report of injury. WSI wants a record that when someone gets hurt so that they can follow up and understand what happened to prevent it from happening in the future. And that's really gives them data to, on the grand scale, figure out what they can do to help workplaces prevent injuries for their employees. So that's really to everyone's benefit. So with the pre-existing, if you hide it and it's found out, it's going to be a pretty serious fraud charge. Do not recommend doing that. And if you let them know, hey, look, pre-existing, this happened, my knee in basketball, my back and, lifting weights, whatever it is you did prior to working there that hurt yourself, be very upfront and clear about it, transparent. Not all those things need to be you don't need to let every employer know right away, depending on what it is. But if it does happen, you didn't report it, you definitely want to get that out to them right away. So with that, everyone be safe out there, stay cool in more ways than one. And we really enjoy being here with you. Hopefully you enjoyed our course this month. We'll see you next month. Have a great day.